Hey, good afternoon, students. This is Mr. Verzat. Today I want to cover a little bit about lighting and ISOPARMS, what they are and how they function. So you guys have learned recently how to build things out of basic shapes. Basically, in review, any type of complex form, whether it's a toothbrush or a kitty cat or a mountain, can be broken down into the major basic shapes that are found, for example, a cylinder, a cone, a sphere, or a cube. And using proportion, you can assemble those and use them as a drawing scaffold on top of which you can build and create anything that is realistic. So we're going to go into a new little area, and this is about lighting. And I'm going to show you kind of a technique that I've used in order to understand how things function in 3D. So if we take a look at these two spheres right here, they're essentially the same. They're both the same size, they take up the same amount of paper space, but one gives the illusion of three-dimensional depth, whereas the other one does not. Now, this is how our brain works. The first thing that our brain detects when we look at a form is the outside edge of something, and that's its silhouette. So we immediately see that this is a sphere. Now, the second thing that we notice, and this helps us from bumping into things, is what's called volume. Now, volume is the illusion of depth using light and dark. So for example, we have applied volume to this sphere right here. We've got light, middle, and dark. And once that happens, once we use those and they conform to the curvature and the shape of this sphere form, it gives our brain the illusion that this thing is actually in 3D. And that's what we're doing. We're selling an illusion. We want the viewer to believe the illusion that we have something that's rising up out of the paper. Now, another reason this is so effective with volume in art is that lines don't exist in nature at all. There's just changes in light and dark. So, how does light work? Quick review. Light travels in a straight line as a ray, and when it hits a surface, it bounces off and goes straight back to your eye. Now, general rule of thumb is we've used the 1, 2, 3 read formula. That's used by Scott Robertson over at Art Center. And his method simplifies the way light works very effectively. So when light hits a surface, the angle of that surface adjusts how bright or how dark that surface will be. And the angle of the light relative to the angle of the surface is what determines that. So here's the formula. Remember, 1, 2, 3, read. A 1 is any time a light source hits a surface that's directly perpendicular to it. That'll be the brightest part. And a 2 is where light does not directly hit. It's like indirect light, but that could be an area that is parallel to the direction of the light source. And then a 3 is when the curvature of the form turns away from the light past the little equator zone, and that's the area that's opposite of the light. That's a 3. And if you have those 3 values, you've got a successful form. Now the challenge is how do you know where they go? Well, again, you just use a 1, a 2, and a 3, and it should read. Therefore, anytime there's a change in value, you're telling your viewer's brain that there's happened to be a form change in there. And so that's how shading works. That's how lighting works. Now, the way I'm going to teach you with this is with a tool called an ISOPARM, isometric parameter. Think of it as a wireframe done in like some computer program where they're going to build some sort of a form, and we use that wireframe to get a good 3D, kind of a topographical read of what that form would look like, and then we simply figure out where's the light coming from and what part is perpendicular to that light ray, what part is parallel, and what part turns away from it. And it's very, very easy to calculate what values will be what. So final quick review is there's the 4-point lighting. There is the 1, 2, and 3 in the read, but there's also one called bounce. Bounce light is ambient light. Anytime light bounces off of a surface, it usually lands in this area between 2 darks, for example, the cast shadow and the core here, and it appears slightly darker than the highlight, but lighter than the midtone, and shows up right in this area. It separates 2 forms. We also have a cast shadow. We're going to use all of this on our ISOPARM. So for this image here, I used a photograph of a baby bunny rabbit because it's close to Easter time at the time of this filming. And like right here, we've got a vertical light source, and here we've got a light source directly in front, and then here we've got a backlit light source. Just knowing where the light ray lands perpendicular, parallel, or opposite of on the form, that'll give you the knowledge and the insight to know, hey, this part's going to be white, this part will be gray, this part will be black. And all you need to do is just find the little in-between areas and blend them together. Now let's talk a little about in-between areas and how they work. So if we look over here at a cube, the same principle follows. So perpendicular, light's going to bam, bam, hit right there at a 1 on the front of the cube and the top. 2 is going to be kind of off to the side and parallel, and 3 is opposite. There aren't really any in-betweens in this really simplified graphic. However, if we come down here to this complex looking form, these little slants are going to change into an in-between. So for example, here's a 1, here's a 2. This slant right here will be probably a 1.5-ish around there. Especially if you have an area where there's a cast shadow, where something gets in the way of the light and then casts a shadow on that surface that should be a 1. That's something you want to be mindful of as well. And again, having a solid grid is one of the methods of determining that. So no matter how complex the form, you can break down a form into a grid and know exactly where the 1, the 2, and the 3 is going to be. For example, this lobster, at first glance, you're probably going to look at it and go, holy crud! How in the heck do you draw something like that? Well, really, it's just a bunch of little pieces. If you look over here at this joint, you just treat that as its own isoparm. Where does the 1 and the 2 and the 3 fall? Likewise, its neighbor shapes. It's just like eating a giant steak in several tiny bites. Put them all together, you got yourself some really good lighting. So how do you make the grid? Well, you need to have an understanding of perspective and foreshortening. So if we look at this cylinder right here, we can tell the middle of the front of the cylinder is right here. Here's center. Center line is a very important term that you need to be mindful of. Where is the center line going to fall on this form? And you see, if we have it in perspective, it's going to connect to the very top. But when it goes off in the distance, we've got one area over here on the side that's foreshortened or compressed, and then this side here is a lot larger. That takes practice. I mean, I could show you how to calculate it, but generally try to eyeball where it's at with foreshortening in mind. Now then you use these things called form lines. If you look at the direction that the form is going, for example, if we look at the front of this cylinder, it's curving right here. Likewise, because the structure doesn't really change much, all of these curve lines are going to be pretty close to what's happening here in the foreground. You're just looking at other areas of the form and trying to mimic that or mirror that within the surface contours or cross contours of these form lines here. Now you can do the exact same thing on a complex form. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to draw a big looking blob, and using your brain, you kind of imagine where do you find, what do you think this form is going to look like? What parts are closer to you? What parts are further? Are we looking down at it? Are we looking up? And so on. And really, I'm just going to rotate the paper and just mess around until something looks good to my head. And for this example, I drew a center line first, and then sections, and then some verticals after that, just giving it a cross contour. So let's just take one last look at application. You can do this with any form of complex organic shapes. For example, this was a photograph of a rhino, and I just brought it into Photoshop and started to plot where the verticals would go, the up and down lines. Just imagine a spaghetti noodle draped over all the complex curves and wrinkles and shapes of that rhino. And then I also did the same thing for the horizontals, verticals and horizontals. I started with this center line here though, continued it through all these forms first, gives you kind of a frame of reference that you can work within. Then again, mid-tone, and then you just figure out where your light's going to be and think what parts are the 1s, what parts are the 2s, what parts are the 3s. A fun exercise is to repeat this on the same grid shape, only with different lighting sources. It's a great way to kind of get lighting down. All right, let's look at application. So painting basically is just drawing light. That's it. So there aren't any lines typically in a painting unless your goal is to include those in your work. But for example, this piece, it's still really loose. Knowing what parts of the form are in 3D, like there's a grid over it, really helps you to understand, like in my mind at least, where the light's going to fall. So this big monster looking golem thing here has a big shaft of light in front of it, and so we know that because this part of his wrist is facing the light, we're going to grab this color and paint it in. Likewise, this part of his thigh is facing the lava, so we're going to grab that color, paint it in. This part of his chest is facing down, we're going to grab the lava. This part of his shoulder is facing up, so we're going to grab some of the colors in the cave up here, and so on and so forth. Likewise, this guy's shield facing the lava, facing down, it'll grab the orange color, and this will grab the light, and here's some of the light reflected from the golem monster, and so on. You know, just a simple formula, and as you develop in your ability, you'll be able to get more and more complex with it. So start with just a big old blob, like that. Got a little trouble over here, so I'm just going to solve that problem really quick. Bloop. Okay, and I just wanted my lines to touch so that I could select in here with the magic wand tool. And so now you just think with your brain, you know, take your paper, spin it around. Is this direction the form's going to go? Are we looking up at it or down? Are we going to have kind of a, this would have kind of a flat base in my mind, you know, with a curved bottom over here. It's really up to you and what you see in the work. I'm just going to start like this, and it has kind of a turtle shell look. So think, first of all, let's get the center. And I'm not going to grid the whole thing out from the get-go. I'm going to have a little couple of markers here that I can go by. So imagine where the center is, and in my mind I see it here. Keep that foreshortening in the back of your mind. And ghost first. That gets you a good clean line, so I'm going to ghost, and drop it. If you mess up, just erase or Command Z. And that kind of gives me a feeling for where that's going to go. Now, how do we know what this line's going to do? Well, we're going to look to this outside edge to tell us. Now, the closer to the edge that one of your lines happens to be, then the closer it will mimic the exact curves that go on. The further towards the middle, the less of a curve you're going to have, okay? That's because that line is facing you directly, all right? So we see that this kind of drops off over here, and I'm imagining this in perspective. So in my mind, you know, I might see like a guiding line in perspective, you know, converging off here to a VP if this were in three point. And so that means this little curve's counterpart will be located right about there. So you continue it through. Voila, like so. Now down here at the bottom of the line, one common mistake that students make is they just connect it like a straight line. Well, you see this little guy, he curves, okay? So I'm going to go in here, and let's just erase that bottom part and curve it just a little bit. There, like so. Likewise back here, you see his counterpart starts to curve, so we want him to curve as well. All right, now let's do the exact same thing, only for the front. So imagine, where would the center of this edge be? Like so. Likewise, let's find center for this form going this way too. So I'm going to look back here. We have a little ledge, and it goes back in and then up and around. So find center for this big form first. Okay, and then in perspective, just imagine where that would be. You can have a little guideline to kind of help you know where his counterpart is going to be, which is right about here. And continue him down and over. Now we look over here to see where the other form line is going to curve. Like so. And you continue doing this until you've built up a nice grid. So this is Photoshop. What I'm going to do is, you know, if you're working traditionally, you know, some of these things that you see happen here won't apply. But here in Photoshop, what I'm going to do is just make a selection of the negative space on the outside of this turtle shell. And sure enough, I see I've got a little tail from a line hanging out over here. So I'm going to get rid of him and try it again. Boom. We'll leave him there. And then I'm going to select the inverse so that we have the interior of this shell. And in a new layer that's underneath all of this, I'm going to pick a middle gray and just paint bucket that in. Now I've got my, let me pull my layer palette over here. I've got my line art on top, which I'll lock so I don't accidentally paint on it. I've got my mid-tone right here, and then I'm going to make a new layer, and I'm going to call this light. Now if you want to, you could do a layer for each one of the 1, 2, 3s, and even the bounce and the drop shadow if you want. I'm going to just keep it all on one. But now we've got to determine where our light's going to come from. And I'm just going to have it, what do you say, come from directly above, like directly above where the surface is. And so let's start with the bottom. I'm going to set my brush to about 10% opacity, 10 or 20. And let's look right here, right about where it starts to turn under. This is kind of an equator line, all right? Right where it turns under, that's going to be where our core starts. Oh yeah, made a mistake. Here's why we do the midtone, not just for values, but if you hold down Command and click on that little picture right there, it selects everything in that layer. And I'm going to leave that selection on so I don't paint outside of my form like you just saw me. I want to keep that coarse shadow in there. I'm going to bump it up to about 30 opacity so this happens a little more quickly. So I want good contrast, which means a good range from white to dark. All right, and so this area curves back around, but does not perfectly and perpendicularly get struck by the light ray. If it were a shelf, then it would do that. Now we have a little bit of light gray that's going to happen here, followed by gray and then to dark gray. Likewise up here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to these areas that are kind of mid-tonish and just bump them up a little bit. Remember, just because you start with like a middle gray doesn't mean that it has to conform to that value. I like my values very dark with sharp contrast. And one of the things beginners tend to do, first of all, is they only do the outside edges of their form. Remember, this is a 3D object, so if light hits the top, what you want to do is start like a disc and slowly work your way out, like so, okay? Actually, that light should be here. All right, and just start to build up layers until you get to about light gray. There's actually very little white on a painting or in a form. I sometimes give my students a loose number, like 10%. You want to have like maybe even less than 10% of your painting actually have white. Most of it, at the most, goes to dark gray. Those little tiny highlights that go ding, 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 and light up the your form, those are very few and far between. Okay, we're back, and here is an isoparm. So how do we do that drop shadow and that bounced light? So I'm going to do the drop shadow first, and again, this is where our mid-tone layer right here is going to come in very handy. So all I'm going to do is select that, and in a new layer, paint bucket that black. All right, on top, see how it looks like that? I'm going to pull it to the bottom of the layer order. Pull it to the bottom of the layer order, and then free transform it. Pull that little guy down, like so. Now you've got an interesting little drop shadow. Now if he's floating off the table, you'll separate that shadow quite a bit from the figure or the form. If he's just kind of hovering like just a little bit right there, and there's a little, you can rotate or change the angle of the shadow. You can even manually paint it in, which might be a lot easier. But for beginners, rather than calculate all of that, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to give it a blur, a Gaussian blur. If that's even like pronounced the right way. And voila. Okay, so bounce light, remember the way that works is on the area opposite of where the light is, and especially where the curvature of the form is starting to turn away, light gets compressed. And so, for example, if the light from the environment hits an area, we'll see it most in between two dark areas. So here and the cast shadow is where we're going to see the bounce. So what I'm going to do is, in my lighting layer, I'm going to color sample kind of in this middle mid-tone range, this light gray. And then, again, make sure you got your form selected. And I'm going to go in with a soft, fluffy brush, turned down quite a bit, and just add a hint of shadow to that rim. Now you see we lost our core, and I think I might have done it a little bit too much. So I'm going to do that in a new layer. Try again. And we can turn that down or up using our opacity. Deselect, a little rough, but gets the job done. Okay, and we are back. What I did is I got a picture of a cat off of the internet, and I'm just going to take a hard-edged brush and give you guys an example on how you do this to a photograph. Now, tracing a photograph, it's good for technical ability, but it doesn't really teach you anything in terms of like understanding how this thing is working. I'd recommend that you guys study anatomy and like bone structure and all that good stuff. But in order for determining how to build a grid, I think animals are very good at helping you find center lines and form lines and all that, because it naturally happens in their fur, their markings, and just the symmetry of their features. So first things first, let's build a center form line. I'm going to try to make it nice and big and fat so that you guys can see it. It's coming out. There we go. All right, let's do that. All right, so I'm going to look at his nose, his little schnoz, and hey, guess what? The little guy, he's got a form line that goes to that cute little cleft lip that kitty cats have. It's going to go down like so. Remember, it's not exactly a straight line. This is going to come out and then probably curve in. And I want to talk a little bit about what's called a positive and a negative form line. Positive form lines go out, negative form lines curve in. And so that little guy became a negative when he turned under. Now he's a positive again, and we're going to go down the center of his chin, okay? And end right about there. The rest of him is all kind of blurred out from some photographic depth of field effect. And so let's take the angle of his cute little schnoz and go up, and he's going to curve this way, and we'll follow the little markings that he's got, and he'll disappear right there. And so there is his vertical form line, center line. All right, so let's find the center horizontal kind of axis of his face. Really, you could just, from this stage, just go to town with verticals and then finish off with horizontals later. It's really up to you. There's no right or wrong way to do this. As a matter of fact, I'm just going to do one that right across his schnoz, like so. So his nose is going to curve up, over, down, and then down, and then around his face. Over, down, and then around his face. See how that foreshortening kind of happens there? All right, let's do it again. Up, over, down, and see we got a little bump, so we're going to have a positive, negative, positive. It's going to flow down and around. All right, up, over, down, positive, negative, positive for that little eyelid that he's got, down and around. Up, over. I'm going to quit narrating this. I'll just say positive, negative. How's that sound? Less irritating. And up and over the eye. All right. Down, positive, negative, positive, positive, and around. Up, over, down, positive, negative, positive, and so on. Let's do the same thing vertically here. So we're going to follow this curvature, and you can even see where kind of these corners of all these angles are. That gives you a clue into where the rest of his features are going to go. Out, ooh, out. Okay, just keep going. So I'm going to turn off the photo. Let's take a look at the grid. Probably going to be pretty scary looking. Bam, but you already see we've got some good topography here. And if we lit it from the front or even the back, we'd have enough information to determine what areas are parallel, what areas are perpendicular, what areas are opposite. So I hope this was helpful, and feel free to ask any questions in class if you got them. And I look forward to seeing you guys. Take care.